Okay, so I'm making this video to do an introduction to the philosophy of Martin Heidegger. I will try to do the impossible, try to make it very, very simple, give you an overview of his thinking, and I will try to relate to the philosophy of this thinker in trying to touch two topics, pretty much how we can just place his philosophy and his thinking into a historical context so we can understand what he's doing or what he did, and also his relation to his personal life in terms of the National Socialism or the Nazi Party. Because at the end of the day, I think if we want to have an introduction to Heidegger, we cannot just divide his philosophy and his personal life, because this is so intertwined that at the end of the day, it causes a lot of conflicts in people to start reading Heidegger after knowing that he's a Nazi, or he's a Nazi and reading his philosophy, so it's the same thing. So it is hard to understand this philosophy because at the end of the day, Heidegger is trying to respond to some other traditions before him, and also is trying to overcome certain ways of philosophizing about the world, about our existence, about everything, pretty much. So I think I have to go back to the first main source of discomfort for Heidegger's way of philosophizing, that is Cartesianism. So if we go back to the 17th century, the origin of modernity, and modernity being the world that we have around us right now that is governed by scientific objects like this computer I'm using right now, all the scientific world vision and all the trust in science and the scientific method and everything that you see around you nowadays, that science has become the new religion in some way, is coming originally from the 17th century, from the philosophy of René Descartes. So René Descartes, as a philosopher, it was someone that is obviously emerged in another period that is not the modern, that we can call the Middle Ages or the religious period, a theological period that is dominated by the church. And the world that it was out there, it was not the scientific world or the scientific world vision with all these objects that we have around us right now. It was a religious world where religion and the church was controlling pretty much the official discourse and the framework where you can think reality in a general terms, with its conceptual scheme of God, creature, creator, soul, body, and all that thing that you've been hearing that is coming from another period. It was the legacy that Descartes received. So he's a religious thinker. He thinks in these terms, but he was completely uncomfortable because he also was a rational person. So when you're a rational person and you believe that logic has value and validity and is part of reality, you cannot believe easily things that religions tell you about the Virgin Mary, about the resuscitation of Jesus Christ, about the creation of the world in 7 days. All those things you're not going to believe in the name of reason. You will have to believe in the name of faith. So there's a division between reason and faith that also is something that Descartes took upon, and it created conflicts in his mind, in his existence, because he wanted to give reason and logic validity, but he knew that it was contradictory with religious or with the other knowledge he was receiving from the tradition and his religious upbringing and background. So what he did, he thought that the only way out, it was pretty much a clean slate, pretty much like start all over again and rethink everything, all his beliefs, put them into, let's say, a judgment test, doubt them, and create a new philosophy that it was undoubtable. So in this new way of philosophizing, that it was pretty new because he enacted he enacted this uncomfortableness between the logic and reason and mathematics in some way, because logic and mathematics are completely related, and the religious upbringing and the religious tradition that he was already embedded because of his period of time, the conflict between these two, he would try to resolve in a new philosophy. This new way of philosophizing and trying to resolve this conflict is pretty much the origin of modernity, the origin of criticizing, the origin of critical philosophy. So the philosopher is someone that is going to be criticize what is being received, and in that criticizing action, you will create something out of, not out of nothing, but out of your own reflection, critical thinking. So I guess Descartes is the father in the critical era, let's say, because he's the one that is doubting, and doubting in a hardcore, radical way. So I think that's a way to put Descartes into his context. So is in a way it is a religious thinker, but is not going to get stuck into the religious thinking, and is going to put rational thinking and reason and logic into the picture in a more fundamental way. So what it came out of this, it was a philosophy, that his own philosophy that we can call Cartesianism. Cartesianism, it was a new world vision. It was not the world vision of the religious thinkers, where the world is created by God, so it's a creation of God. God is the creator, so he's not creating himself, but he creates the world, and we are creatures, and everything we see around, the nature we see around, is a creation of the God that is creator. So you have the division between the creator and the creature. So Descartes is going to doubt that because he doesn't have any rational justification for it. So, but still embedded into this tradition, he cannot just say, I don't believe in this, I think this is wrong. So he has to justify it in a new way. He has to just melt it with reason and with something new. So what he creates, obviously, is a reflection upon these concepts. But what he does at the end is produce a new kind of philosophizing, a new framework to understand reality, the experience of human beings. So in this way, it's not pretty much, the main focus is not on the creator and the creature, but more in the distinction between the reality of ourselves and the outside of ourselves. So pretty much we have what we are in an internal sense, in what we are in essence, pretty much a mind, all right, a subject, okay, something that thinks, something that observes, like kind of like a nucleus that is the one that is doing the thinking, doing the perceiving, doing the imagining, doing everything, and something that is being perceived, being imagined, being thought. So the division between this new framework allowed Descartes to give, in certain way, to the religious part of the tradition that he received, some diminished way of the soul and God in some way, because this is more complex, but it's a substance that is finite, that is our being, actually the thinking thing, or the subject, or the mind, you can call it that way, that is distinct from the body. All right, so that's the religious part of Descartes. So the mind and the body are distinct, or the soul and the body are distinct. He doesn't call it soul in some way. He call it the cogito, but it's the same thing. So pretty much he's trying to give the religious background of his thinking, that they can relate to that in this way now. So basically, the soul is now reinterpreted as the mind, or the cogito, all right, the I. Is distinct from the body, so that's the religious part, okay? And the body is part of nature. So nature is in some way the creator, the creature, right? The creature of the creator. But now he's going to say that he's not going to say the creator and the creator on the creature. He's going to say that there's the I, or the subject, or the He's not going to use the soul, but he's going to use the cogito. It's the same thing in some way. Is the religious now is reinterpreted, and the outside of the cogito of the soul that is distinct from the body is nature. But nature is going to be reinterpreted in something that occupies space. So basically, he's going to spatialize nature. I was going to say that it counts as nature, very much. The spatial relations and the possible measurements of that entity that we call the res extensa. So what is extended in space. So there is a division now in reality, not between the creator. I mean, the framework to interpret the world is not based on the creator and the creature so much, but more in between the soul and the body, or in his terms, the res cogitans, a substance that thinks and observes and imagines and all that, and what is being observed, which is nature, or the res extensa, which is something spatial and can be measured by mathematical and rational terms. So in one slap, let's say, Descartes gave the religious their own thing, which is the soul and the rest, the cogito, and it gave science and rational inquiry his own domain. So it kind of like separated the world like before, but now it gave more grounds and more understanding for science to inquire reality and try to understand, measure, and do all the things that modernity did later on until we get all these objects that are based on mathematical inquiry. Okay, so what it came out of this, and it was extremely dogmatic and in some way self-evident. It's not self-evident, but it looks like it was self-evident. It was a distinction between these two worlds, the inner world of the mind and the outer world of material nature, right? So the distinction, it kind of like dogmatized. It got dogmatized by the framework that Descartes gave to the world to, in some way, overcome the religious framework, you know? So it moved from a theological era, thinking about in these terms, in this concept, God, creator, to an anthropological era, because now it's based on the subject, or in us, and the soul, which is related to God and all that, because Descartes is still religious, but the focus, the main point is in the subject, in the person that is doing this inquiry or this observation or this thinking. So it puts the man on the center. It puts this fundament in the center, right? So obviously now the fundament is not theological, it's not based on the creator, it's based on the I, or the cogito, which is now the creator of reality, of our experience. Okay, so when it came out, it was a dualism. I already explained you the inner and the outer, or the res cogitans or res extensa. This dominates philosophy and the way of thinking for the 17th century, the 18th century, the 19th century, until the beginning of the 20th century, when Heidegger comes into play. But this framework, it was systematized and perfected much, much more by what we call phenomenology. It was kind of like when Heidegger comes into philosophy. Phenomenology is the main thing, and phenomenology is the philosophy of Edmund Husserl, which is in some way a Cartesian. So instead of like in the means of his thinking from the Cartesian philosophy, from the Cartesian subject, the framework that Descartes created to think modernity, to think modernly, right? So the thing is that the thing for Heidegger and when he came into the picture is that he received the same way Descartes received the religious concepts and all that. He tried to reinterpret it and overcome it. He received a very, very, very sophisticated way of Cartesianism, which we can call phenomenology. So in the phenomenology of Edmund Husserl, his master, and he was assistant of this philosopher, and he was creating a new way to just give a license to think again with a method and with certain concepts that liberate you from prejudgments and some other traditions. So it gives you a way to rekindle the experience, let's say, of being right here in the world. So he has a main conflict with this right away. That is that when you talk about the conscious or the ego or the mind or whatever, you are just, maybe that's the starting point of your philosophy, that distinction between the what is conscious and what is not conscious, or what is subject and what is not subject, which is object. When you are making that distinction, you are saying, or you are taking for granted that that thing is, right? So you are basing the whole philosophy project into saying there's something called the ego, or there's something called the conscious. So in the case of Husserl, it was phenomenology is a science of phenomena. So phenomena, what is phenomena? What appears, whatever appears. For example, this appears to me. So this is appearing to someone, right? To something. That thing that the phenomena appears is conscious. So phenomenology is the study of phenomena, but phenomena are the phenomena of consciousness. So you are in some way not questioning what is that consciousness. You're just taking it for granted by elaborating a theory of the phenomena of consciousness. So Heidegger thinks that this is not really radical, and it's not really philosophizing until the core, because you are just saying the consciousness is, but you are not asking what is means. So this leads his way to philosophizing to go back to the question for the is. Basically, if we're going to say that something is as a starting point, in the case of phenomenology, is going to be consciousness, we need to first know what we mean by is. If we don't know what we mean by is, we cannot say that consciousness is, and we cannot base anything on that. So this leads his philosophical project to question, or to re-ask the question for being, right? So is a way to introduce Heidegger into the picture, right? So pretty much, obviously, this distinction between inner and outer for him feel artificial. Consciousness and the world feel artificial. Every division that is coming from the Cartesian framework, it feels in some way artificial, because it's not questioning the being itself, the being in itself. First of all, as a concept that we use to theorize, to philosophize, we're already using the concept of being to say this is consciousness, and these are the phenomena of consciousness, or whatever you're saying. There is the mind, there is the body, there is the inner, there is the outer. We're using the word is without understanding exactly what we mean by it, but we feel in some way that we understand it because we are using it, and it's kind of like intuitively understood, but it's not clarified, it's not thematic. Never was a philosopher that it was like, I'm going to make this my project to understand this concept before I start doing anything else. So that's the project of what Heidegger called ontology, or actually fundamental ontology, because you have to question that first before you do anything else. So that's completely different from what his master Husserl was doing, because he is already not taking for granted the concept of consciousness, or consciousness as something that we have access to, but actually the concept itself is problematic. And Heidegger was like, if we're going to be radical enough, we have to question that. And that is going to be the question for being, the meaning of being. So that's the meaning part. He's not asking for being, he's asking for the meaning of being. So the meaning of the concept itself, being, the word being, is something that is going to take his project into another direction. Because at the end of the day, we have certain understanding of that concept, but it's not clear, and that implicit understanding of the concept itself, of the word, when we use it in trivial ways, is what interests in him. So that's what he called the pre-ontological understanding of being, because we understand it, but not as an ontology, not as a science of this understanding. It's not explicit and thematic, but we do understand it prior to make it a philosophical inquiry. That is the pre-ontological understanding of this concept. And that is when he wants to inquiry, right? So that project is what created the famous book Being and Time, right? Being and Time is pretty much the project of Heidegger to create an ontological, that like fundamental ontology, pretty much understanding that little word that we use to say that anything else is. Okay, so I guess that's for the critic of Heidegger as he emerged into a historical moment where Cartesianism is still framing and modeling the way of thinking until his very master, which is Husserl. Okay, so there is a departure between the relation between Husserl and Heidegger, because Heidegger now is criticizing the very fundaments of the framework that Husserl is using to create his philosophy, his world vision. Okay, so this break is completely radical, because now Heidegger is saying pretty much, I'm going to go into inquire this thing, the meaning of this concept, and I'm not going to be using these frameworks without answering this question first, or inquiring into this question first. Okay, so obviously that's a starting point for him. Doesn't enable him to use these concepts anymore, right? Because he cannot say, I'm going to inquire into this question and start using the concept of inner and outer, conscious and with the world, subject and object, because all those concepts are begging the question now, are putting into this let's say doubt in some way. You know, you're not, they're putting out a game, let's say, because you cannot use them without making this question first. So the Being and Time, his book, is pretty much the first book in history that is, in the history of the modern thought, let's say, that is not using these concepts explicitly. So it's basically, it's not consciously not using any of these concepts. It doesn't talk about consciousness, it doesn't talk about subject and everything, because he cannot use them. His own very project doesn't allow them to use them. So that's very important to understand when you read the text, because at the end of the day, it's going to be completely new. And he also creates a new concept to relate to what is being doing this thinking, this philosophizing, which is called Dasein. Dasein is something, not the subject. No, it's not the Cartesian or the Husserlian or the Kantian subject, because he's not doing that anymore. That thing is begging the question. But he needs to refer to himself in some way. So obviously he's going to refer to himself as the one that's raising this question, obviously. So the question of being is raised by someone, and that is the Dasein. The Dasein is the one that has the understanding, the pre-ontological understanding of the concept of being. So in some way understand being, but it's not explicit. But that's the starting point, you see, because now we can say that that being, that entity is the one that understands being. So that is going to be the Dasein, is the one that is open to the question and open to the understanding of being. Now we're going to inquire about this understanding, but that's the starting point. Okay, so I guess that's a way to break. That's a good way to break into the philosophy and the starting point of Heidegger. And I think I should mention something about this new entity that he creates in his philosophizing, the Dasein. The Dasein obviously is not going to be someone that has a nucleus, you see, from where he can distinct himself from the external world, because that is already begging the question. So the Dasein is something, is an entity that it just raised the question. But when you analyze this entity, you're gonna see that this entity is something. No, it's not something, because it's not an entity in the way that, like any other entity, is placed there, but is the one that is open to this experience, that we can say, of being. And that openness is in some way temporal, because the temporalization of being is something that Heidegger does, and is the radical move he does. So pretty much in the way of eliminating this middle point or nucleus of the ego, of the subject, of the consciousness that is doing this relation to the world, he's melting this point into the experience itself, into the environment. So now there's no clear separation between the environment and the entity that is doing the questioning. That is extremely radical, because it's his move to trying to just distance himself enough from the tradition of the Cartesian tradition, let's say. So by not allowing himself to use the concept of subject and object, or the distinction between mental and material, or any other distinction to describe this experience, he needs to melt the experience into the experience itself, let's put it that way. So the subject is already integrated into one holistic phenomena, which the environment, and that's what he calls the Dasein, or the being in the world. So the being in the world is already melted, let's say. This is a bad way, but it's already integrated so fundamentally into the environment, into the world, that you cannot make a clear distinction between subject and object and all that. That is begging the question. He's not even using that. So he comes with this structure. The starting point is Dasein, and the starting point is that Dasein is in the world. This makes a lot of sense, because the distinction between the inner and the outer is obviously artificial when you think about that you're eating something external and you put it inside your body, and then that thing that it was external now becomes internal, it becomes you. Where's the distinction there? When you're breathing from the environment, you are taking air from the outside, put it in the inside, and now the air is you. So what happened there? Did the outer became the inner, or the inner became the outer? It's because the distinction itself is artificial. It's a framework that we're forcing into reality to understand it. But at the end of the day, it doesn't allow us to understand what is actually the actual phenomena of existing and being here. Okay, so Heidegger is smart enough to make all those moves. But the melting of the subject into the environment, it makes you historical, because the environment right now is going to be created by history, because all this object, for example, is created by, if I'm melted with the environment, there's no possibility to create distinctions between me and the environment, or create a dualistic ontology, let's put it that way. This object, for example, it was created by, this didn't exist 100 years ago. This company didn't exist. This object itself didn't exist, etc. So everything around you is already putting you into history, because the objects around you are already embedded into a historical context. So the subject, the Dasein, is already embedded into history, into the environment, and the environment is already historical. Okay? So in this radical move that Heidegger does into dissolving the ego, dissolving the nucleus, the subject, the subjectivity as modernity before him understood it, he made the subject, you cannot even talk about subject anymore, but this entity completely temporal and historical. That's why the book is called Being and Time, which is being from time, from the perspective of temporality. So that's why being from time will be the perfect name for the book. So when he does that, the entity, the human being, is dissolved into the environment, dissolved into this historical process, dissolved into temporality. He doesn't have any transcendental sphere. The concept of transcendentality, it means that there's something universal, something that is not historical, something not relative to history or to anything, something that is kind of like the laws of logic, kind of like they work anytime, anywhere. Husserl, his master, had it, the transcendental ego. Kant had it, the transcendental subjectivity. Descartes had it, the ego, the cogito, but he cannot do that anymore. So the subject is dissolved into the historical process and also integrated into what is the environment. That's what he called facticity. All right? Facticity is a main concept in Heideggerian philosophy. Okay, this has radical consequences for the way you think about everything. I think Heidegger move is exceptionally radical and probably is the way to go, but also is kind of like a knife with two sides that can cut you from different sides. When you get dissolved into the environment, and you cannot get abstracted from this environment, you dissolve your nucleus, and you're just a constant flux of experience. But you can understand only by structures, because the book is going to give you the structures of this entity. So it's just a constant flux embedded in time and history, but he's going to talk about certain consistency by giving you the structures, the order of this experience, what he called the existential structures. In any case, because you are so dissolved, the Dasein is so dissolved in the historical process, into the historical environment, the environment that you find yourself in is going to be your culture, obviously, because for Heidegger specifically, that is not a world traveler like me, that everything is my environment is completely different. Now I'm in Thailand. Before I was in the United States. Before that I was in Europe. I'm traveling the world. But for Heidegger, that doesn't travel. It's not like Nietzsche that you move from Germany to Italy or has certain connections, or Leibniz that was a traveler as well, or some other philosophers. His environment, he's already melted into the environment, and his environment is Germany, all right? It's not even Germany, it's a village of Germany, or a very colonial environment, very traditional colonial environment, German environment. So obviously, when he does this move of dissolving the subject into the environment, into the surroundings, and the surroundings that he finds himself there is Germany and the German culture and the German way of living, obviously there is a nationalism in his thinking. This is coming from the de-transcendentalization of the subject. So philosophically, the move leads you to meld yourself into culture, to meld yourself into the environment. That's the way to overcome dualism, the Cartesian framework, but also is the way to embed the subject into history, into the flux of time. Okay, so there is a way to interpret that this way of decentralizing the subject and de-transcendentalize the subject leads you naturally to nationalism, especially for a person like Heidegger that is not a world traveler. He doesn't travel, okay? So obviously he's stuck in Germany, let's put it that way. And the relation of Heidegger this is just now to another point with the Nazis, with the party politically. It's also related to this because if you are merging yourself in the environment, in your description, in your phenomenological description of this entity that you are, you cannot use all these categories. They are put out of play. You merge yourself in history and time. Obviously, if you are like Heidegger, you're going to be melted into Germany. But that doesn't imply that you're going to think that this merging into this specific culture is superior to another merging in another culture, let's say French or Asian or South American or American. So there's not Nazism into saying that the Dasein is merged into a temporal flux of history. So that's why people don't want to see Nazism into being and time, because at the end of the day, he never say, we need to, this is the best superior merging into history from this point of view, which is Germany. But there is a glimpse into what he calls authenticity, right? Despite he doesn't say, this nationalism of mine is superior to others' nationalisms, there is a glimpse into what he calls that there is a distinction between not the superior and the inferior, but the authentic and the inauthentic. So if you are authentic, you will recognize this merging into temporal and historical process. If you are inauthentic, you don't recognize it. So for Heidegger in Being and Time, when he already lay out the structures of Dasein, which are historical and temporal, the merging is unavoidable. You will merge into your environment and in time. But if you're authentic, all right, you will have to merge in one of them. You cannot merge in all of them. So that's also coming from his way of living life, which is not traveling the world, all right? Identifying and attaching himself to a specific way of culture. So by him saying authenticity, it is, let's say, accepting this condition of being merged into history and temporality, is also a way of saying that you have to merge. If you are born here, you have to merge with this one. You can't just move around and merge with another one, all right? So that's where you can see the glimpses of his political affiliation with Nazism, even in Being and Time. This, of course, is going to be debate, and people are going to try to separate the two, blah, blah, blah. But at the end of the day, there's no real separation between the philosophizing of a philosopher and the philosophy itself. Nietzsche already understood this, and he said very clearly that all philosophies are a confession of the philosopher. But he's smart enough not to say they're superior, inferior, but he say authenticity, authentic and inauthentic, or owning your merging and not owning your merging. This obviously comes very congruent with him because he's very German and very traditionally embedded in his soil and his culture and his rituals. So he in some way has to defend that way of life. That's the only way I understand it. That's why I still think he's a very good philosopher, despite he's a Nazi. And a person like me that is a world traveler, and I live all my life moving around with no problem, and I don't have attachments to a specific soil or a specific culture. Actually, my freedom is based on moving around, moving not like ungrounded, because I settle in cities, different countries, and then I move when I feel like it. For Heidegger, that will be very inauthentic, and that will be very ungrounded. It means that I'm not owning my own heritage, my own like, let's say, involvement into the temporal scheme. That's because he's different. He's different than me, and he's thinking from his perspective in that sense, and it makes sense. But that doesn't mean that that's the truth about that. I mean, it's perfectly no. That's perfectly. It's perfectly normal nowadays, and actually it's perfectly valid. Let's put it that way, and coherent. Being a nomad, right? You can move around, even if you are going to have certain structures that are coming from your upbringing and the experience that you have, right? But it's really stupid to think that being nomadic is inauthentic and you are betraying your blood or your tradition and all that. That is very low-minded of Heidegger to think that. And I think that's the way he went straight to National Socialism and the Nazi Party, because of his basic attachment to the nation, right? Obviously, being nomadic, it forced you to detach yourself from nationalisms, because you have to be grateful for the nation you are living. In this case, I'm living now in Thailand, but now I'm going to move to another country, let's say Indonesia or Japan or whatever. I have to be grateful for that culture that is hosting me, or not even hosting me, because it means that I'm a stranger. But at the end of the day, the environment that is giving me everything that I think and everything that I feel. So the nomadic, diasporic thing is also how you link Heidegger to the National Socialism and the anti-Semitism, because the Jews are pretty much nomadic. They are not grounded in one soil. They don't have a soil like that. So that's how you link all this into the Heidegger's philosophy. And I think that's the way I have to stop defending it, because still, being and Time is a masterpiece of philosophy. It doesn't really matter. And he's smart enough not to say anything Nazi in the book. You have to decode it to understand that this makes sense with his personal life. But the temporalization of the subject, the historization of the subject, the merging of the entity that we are into the environment, that's all valid, and we have to do that. But the consequences and the close-mindedness about thinking that implies another way of living or another lifestyle is what you have to condemn in Heidegger philosophy and later involvement with the National Socialism. So that's my critical view. I hope this helped, and I hope this clarifies certain things about Heidegger as an introduction and his relation to the Nazi Party.